GTV presenta. GTV presenta. GTV presenta.
Welcome to the Contreras Report. Good morning. This is Raul Lowry Contreras, your correspondent. Today, we're going to speak extensively about events going on in Mexico and the United States that directly affect each other. Are we headed for a war of tariffs? Will President Biden get his way and screw the Mexican auto industry? We don't know this. These are things that we will be facing in the near future. Then we're going to discuss some American politics that have changed since Biden became president. On the first day he was president, he stopped construction of Donald Trump's wall. But this week alone, the Biden administration has announced that they're going to continue some work on the wall, some work that is necessary, they feel. And we're going to discuss the Mexican situation under President López Obrador and his attempt to return Mexico to the 1970s semi-dictatorship of President Luis Echeverría. Let's get started.
Regresamos.
La cabaña de Anita, cocina económica.
Mi nombre es Laura Vizcarra, tengo 18 años en el mundo de la micropigmentación y actualmente soy artista film. Si tú estás interesada en hacer microblading, es venir conmigo, hacer una consulta y una valoración previa y así poderte explicar más del procedimiento de microblading. ¿Quieres lucir unas cejas hermosas? Te invito a que me visites en Meraki Beauty Salón, es gratis, te esperamos.
El café del Moreno le pone sabor a su vida. Venga a conocer nuestra nueva sucursal en Otay. Estamos por la subida de la central camionera frente a la plaza Otay Alameda. Contamos con una gran variedad de deliciosas bebidas y postres. También nos encuentras en Plaza Río, frente a Burger King.
Welcome back. Let's talk about politics in the United States now. Secretary Mayorkas allows the Customs Border Protection Agency to build some of the border wall. That is the Trump wall. Kinda, sorta. The Department of Homeland Security announced Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas has authorized the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency to, quote, move forward with activities necessary to address life, safety, environmental, and remediation requirements for border barrier projects previously undertaken by the Department of Defense under President Trump. The green light to do some small construction on the border wall system, which President Joe Biden halted on his first day in office, will take place in the San Diego and El Centro sectors in California. That's the entire border with Mexico for the state of California. The Yuma and Tucson sectors in Arizona. That's the entire border in the state of Arizona. And the El Paso and Del Rio sectors in Texas. The Rio Grande Valley, the hardest hit sector along the southern border, was not named in the announcement because similar restoration projects were approved in July. The products will mainly focus on actions not related to building more miles of sections and any gaps that were created by the Biden administration that will now be closed have been described as small. Completing and/or installing drainage to prevent flooding, installing and completing permanent erosion control and slope stabilization measures to ensure the safety and stability of structures in the region, complementing prior construction of patrol maintenance and access roads by adding guardrails, signage, and integrating existing roadways to address safety concerns, remediating temporary use of areas such as lay-down yards and haul roads and project areas impacted by construction, disposing of residual materials not required for completion of the work as identified above, closing small gaps that remain open from prior construction activities, and remediating incomplete gates. Quote, in furtherance of Presidential Proclamation 10142, the Deputy Secretary of Defense directed the cancellation of all Department of Defense 284 projects. The U.S. Corps of Engineers, Army Engineers, on behalf of DoD, is in the process of terminating the construction contracts for these projects. As part of that process, DoD, Defense Department, will turn over unfinished projects to DHS, Department of Homeland Security, in various stages of completion to undertake activities necessary to address urgent life, safety, environmental, or other remediation required to protect border communities, said the DHS in their press release. In contrast, Texas Governor Abbott, Republican, announced on last week the beginning of a similar border wall system in the Rio Grande Valley sector on state land using state funds. Abbott's administration inquired about using the wall materials that have already been paid for by taxpayers and have been sitting outside since the federal wall construction project was halted, but they never heard back from the Biden administration. Now, that came from an article from Axios Latino, written by Russell Contreras and Margaret Telev. Here is more information. Axios Ipsos, in partnership with Noticias Telemundo, a poll, opposition among U.S. Latinos to walling off the U.S.-Mexican border is being driven by Mexican Americans and Central Americans, while this is understandable, Puerto Ricans are more ambivalent, and a majority of Cuban Americans support the wall, according to the inaugural Axios Ipsos Latino poll in partnership with Noticias Telemundo. Why it matters. It's one striking example of the deep divisions among U.S. Latinos on a range of political and cultural issues that break down across geographic and generational lines. The poll also found Latinos broadly support teaching about racism in school, but not if it's described as, quote, critical race theory, unquote, a trigger Republicans may seek to exploit in races around the country next year, the off-year elections. Driving the news, these are among the findings in the first installment of a national poll that examines the political, societal, and cultural attitudes of a diverse population comprising nearly 1 in 5 Americans in the 2020 census, and about 13% of eligible U.S. voters. COVID-19 and crime or gun violence were the top 2 concerns of U.S. Latinos, while immigration ranked behind climate change and inflation and supply chain issues. Here are the numbers. Nearly 3/4 of Mexican Americans surveyed said they strongly or somewhat oppose the border wall. There are more than 38 million Mexican Americans in the U.S., about 62% of the population. 72% of Central Americans in the U.S. also oppose the wall. In recent years, migrants fleeing violence and poverty in Central America have been the largest group seeking entry via the U.S.-Mexico border. This is no surprise. 54% of Cuban Americans in the survey said they strongly or somewhat support a border wall or fence. Cuban Americans comprise but 2 million people, or 3.2% of Latinos in the country, but because of their political hold in Florida, they hold a disproportionate political power. Nearly 45% of Puerto Ricans said they support a wall. Puerto Ricans, let me remind you, are U.S. citizens by birth since 1917, when the U.S. Congress passed a law automatically making Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens. Of course, the Congress had something other than benefit in mind. They wanted to draft Puerto Ricans to fight in World War I, and they couldn't draft them unless they were citizens. That's why they made them citizens. Now, they are U.S. citizens by birth, whether they live in the 50 states or in Puerto Rico, but they cannot vote for president, by the way, or Congress or the Senate. Between the lines, for decades, Central American and Mexican immigrants have faced violence along the U.S.-Mexican border from law enforcement agencies. And let me remind you that the Texas Rangers are famous for massacring dozens and dozens of Mexicans in the early 20th century, and no one was ever punished. These people see the wall as a symbol of discrimination, the ones who object to the wall. They also have been targeted for massive deportation operations in the U.S. that sometimes have wrongly caught up Mexican Americans. Cuban Americans have had an easier path to the U.S. under preferential Cold War era policies that allow Cubans fleeing the socialist country to enter the United States. Recall the wet foot, dry foot policy. If a Cuban could float across the Florida Straits 90 miles over salt water on a raft made of inner tubes or a boat or however, and he could put 1 foot on a dry beach, he was automatically allowed to stay. Anybody else, if a Mexican did that, he was illegally in the U.S. Overall, 58% of all Latinos surveyed said they opposed the border wall. That's all of them. What they're saying. Cliff Young, president of Ipsos U.S. Public Affairs, said, quote, proximity to the issue is a major factor in how different groups of Latinos view the wall. Quote, you can think of proximity both in terms of distance and headspace. The closer you are to the border, the more salient border issues are. But it's also, have I experienced it directly or indirectly? Between the lines, support for the wall is higher among Latino respondents the longer their families have lived in the United States. The survey found support among 25% of first-generation Americans, 34% among the second generation, and 43% for third generation and higher. But, the poll also found 68% of respondents, of all Latino respondents, support a path to citizenship for people in the country illegally. Around 60% said they support allowing refugees fleeing crime and violence in Latin America to claim asylum in the U.S. And here's what we're watching. 69% of Latinos support public schools teaching about the history of slavery and racism. But that drops to 39% when they are asked whether they support teaching critical race theory, highlighting the effect of a conservative-led campaign that falsely claims critical race theory is in schools and how it's affecting Latinos. The methodology of this Axios Ipsos Latino poll in partnership with Noticias Telemundo was, the poll was conducted between December 2nd and 14, 2021 by Ipsos Knowledge Panel. This poll is based on a nationally representative probability sample of 1,064 Hispanic Latino adults age 18 or older. Now, from the National Review, here's an article. Republicans don't need to abandon immigration hawkishness to win Hispanics. The GOP is making gains among Hispanics without liberalizing on issues such as immigration. For years, elite conventional wisdom held that Republicans needed to liberalize on immigration to make inroads with Hispanic voters. This theory enjoyed bipartisan support. On the left, John B. Judas and Rui Tejera, in their emerging Democratic majority thesis, which Tejera has since retracted, posited that the growing Hispanic share of the electorate would result in a permanent leftward shift in the nation's politics. He's retracted that. On the right, the Republican National Committee's famous post-2012 autopsy called for a softening of the party's stance on cultural issues to adapt to the country's changing demographics, particularly with regard to immigration. Among the steps Republicans take in the Hispanic community, the autopsy said, and beyond, we must embrace and champion comprehensive immigration reform, the autopsy urged. If we do not, our party's appeal will continue to shrink to its core constituencies only. Going a step further, the Republican National Committee autopsy argued that comprehensive immigration reform is consistent with Republican economic policies that promote job growth and opportunity for all. Given the context in which the 100-page document was written, that thesis seemed logical. A commitment to more permissive immigration policies not only looked like the right call in the face of emerging Democratic majorities, style political framework that Republican consultants and strategists had implicitly accepted, but it also conveniently coincided with the pre-existing policy preferences of the Republican donor class and powerful business interests, for whom mass low-skilled immigration was a way to maximize economic productivity. In other words, from where most of the Acela corridor, that's the Washington-New York Railroad corridor, was sitting, immigration liberalism just made sense to that corridor. There was a time not so long ago when the writer subscribed to the version of this theory himself. But times have changed. The cracks in the vision laid out by the post-2012 GOP autopsy began to show with Donald Trump's upset victory in 2016, which was won by channeling the very cultural passions that the Republican consultant class had wanted to leave behind. In other words, racism and anti-immigrants. Anyway, Republican elites may have seen worker visas and amnesty packages as the party's future. Their voters, however, did not. To be sure, Trump's razor-thin margin of victory was primarily delivered by the white working class, which is primarily Democratic, not Republican. Their shrinking share of the electorate may well not be enough for a winning coalition in the future. The writer says, and I agree, it doesn't, but the GOP's more recent inroads with Hispanics, this is an illusion, by the way, a cohort that is on track to be the largest share of non-white voters in the country, points toward the possibility of a genuinely competitive national coalition, and this writer that wrote this article is an idiot. And those gains are being made without liberalizing on issues such as immigration. A widely discussed new Wall Street Journal poll shows that Hispanic voters, according to this poll, are now evenly split between the parties, polling at 37% apiece, with another 22% still undecided. That's a fantasy of white poll takers. It's just one poll, but it reflects a broader rightward trend in the demographic that has become increasingly unambiguous in recent years, says the writer of the National Review. Trump increased his support with Hispanics by about 8 points. That's not true. From 2016 to 2020. He actually got 28%, according to exit polls. That's not accurate, but it might be. In 2016, and he got to 32%. That's only 4 points in 2020. But the swings were far more dramatic in states such as Florida and Texas. Florida's Miami-Dade County, which is 68% Hispanic, read Cuban, swung toward Trump by 22 points. That's true. While Texas Starr County, which is 99% Hispanic, swung toward Trump by 55 points. That is not true. Let's define Starr County. Okay? Starr County has 65,000 people. That's about 2 postal codes in Southern California. 41% are under 18, thus they can't vote. At best, 44,850 people voted if every single adult voted, which we know they didn't. Biden carried the county, ladies and gentlemen. 60% turnout of the means that, and 96% are Hispanic, not 99%. They're actually Mexican American. There aren't any Cubans in there in Texas. Only 53% have a high school education, not a well-educated group. Median income is $30,000. Median income for the year is $30,000 per household. Compare that to $90,000 in California. Per capita income is only $14,000. Poverty is 1 out of 4, 25%. And most of these Mexican Americans call themselves white. More recently, Glenn Youngkin beat his Democratic opponent, Terry McAuliffe, outright with Hispanics in the Virginia gubernatorial race. That is very interesting. Fewer Mexican Americans there, mostly Cubans, Salvadorans, and Venezuelanos. And the across-the-board decline in Biden's approval ratings have been sharpest, according to this writer, among Hispanics. As of the end of October, it was sitting below 40%. In other words, the conditions that are pushing Hispanic voters toward the GOP are the exact inverse of the strategy laid out by the RNC autopsy. The autopsy argued that Hispanic voters saw our party's position on immigration as a litmus test and advocated instead for a focus on free market economics and opportunity, the traditional Reaganite economic passage. Let us remember, and let me basically end this subject with Ronald Reagan. He supported for 5 years what became known as IRCA, the Immigration Reform Act of 1976, 86, in which amnesty was granted to almost 3 million people who were in the country illegally. Ronald Reagan signed that bill. And although there are rumors that he didn't like that in later years, that is not true. Those are lies. He never rejected his signing into law, IRCA 1986, which made 3 million people legal, most of which became citizens. That is the real story. Republicans support citizenship for illegal residents. When they do that, they will win the election outright, not by a tiny little fraction like Trump did in 2016. That is the future. Let's wind that up with, that is the future. Pro-immigration, pro-citizenship, pro-legality, and the Republicans will win every election. Let us not forget that. Okay, thank you for being there. We'll be back in a moment.
Regresamos.
Pastelería Riviera, con más de 40 años deleitando tu paladar, especializados en exquisitos pasteles para toda ocasión. Además, elaboran riquísimos postres y bocadillos para cafeterías, restaurantes o cualquier evento. Pregunta por sus paquetes. Visítalos en Boulevard Aguacaliente, esquina Avenida Negrete, local 1 y 2, Tijuana, a un costado del correo. Pastelería Riviera.
Mexico. Welcome to Mexico and the wonderful Christmas United States Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia gave Mexico and Canada. The gift came when he announced he could not vote for President Biden's multi-trillion-dollar goof, the Build Back Better Act. If Biden succeeds, the U.S. will be dragged into various courts for years, for courts it has created in trade agreements. Costs will be in billions of dollars in trade. The largest trade agreement in history, the USMCA, the 2-year-old U.S., Mexican, and Canadian trade agreement, will be trashed, and the American people will suffer greatly. Biden's Build Back Better bill is dead in the water. It should be. It is pure drivel. It is pure socialist and union baloney. The apparent demise of the Build Back Better Act, the BBB, in the United States is a Christmas present for Mexico, according to Mexican Economy Minister Tatiana Clouthier. Raul would add to America, Democrat Senator Joe Manchin announced he wouldn't support BBB, effectively killing off the proposed legislation, which has already been approved by the United States House of Representatives. If passed by the Senate, BBB would increase credits available to United States consumers buying U.S.-made electric vehicles, EVs, from U.S. $7,500 to as much as U.S. $12,500, and would require the entire vehicle to be made in U.S. territory. Electric vehicles made in Mexico or Canada would not qualify for the subsidies despite their being made in North America like regular cars are today. The Mexican Employers Federation, Coparmex, warned that the bill poses a threat to the Mexican automotive industry, while the Mexican federal government indicated that it would retaliate commercially if the proposed legislation passed the U.S. Congress in its current form. Coparmex and the government said that the proposed legislation violates the provisions of the United States-Mexico-Canada USMCA Trade Agreement, the Free Trade Pact that took effect just last year. Clouthier, on Monday, celebrated Manchin's rejection of BBB in a Twitter post in which she wrote, quote, "It seems that our Christmas present came early. We're very happy because our efforts are finding an echo, strengthening Mexico's position against the incentives initiative for EVs made exclusively in the United States. By, I might add, from a president that apparently doesn't know that less than 1 in 10 American workers are unionized." While the future of BBB is uncertain, the United States planned to offer additional incentives to consumers buying U.S.-made EVs made exclusively in the U.S., and Mexico's plan to overhaul the electricity market to favor the state-owned Federal Electricity Commission could trigger a trade dispute between the two countries. This is the real problem. This potential conflict could erupt and cost Mexico 1 million jobs and cost 330 million Americans billions of dollars more of their precious money in the form of higher food prices for food, more expensive houses for construction materials, and cost more American jobs and tie up the U.S. government in courts for years. American companies have denounced the proposed electricity reform, arguing that it violates the USMCA. Quote, "Although they're independent paths, each of the actions unfortunately intersects with each other," says former Mexican Economy Minister Ildefonso Guajardo, now a federal congressman. He said that if the electricity reform passes the Mexican Congress, a vote that might occur in April, private companies will sue Mexico in the investment court system created by USMCA, and that there is also the possibility of state-to-state dispute. If the United States wins the dispute, it could impose tariffs on Mexican imports. For its part, Mexico should take actions to dissuade an increase to incentives that apply exclusively to U.S.-made EVs. The former minister, citing tariffs on some American products as an option. In other words, if wording was changed to qualify all electric vehicles made in USMCA territory of Canada and Mexico and the U.S., there would be no problem. No one would sue. The former economy minister, the previous government's chief USMCA negotiator, said the current proposals of both the Mexican and United States governments send a message that it's okay to violate the new trade pact willy-nilly. And that's to the detriment, he says, of the future and growth of the region being the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. The Biden administration's EV plan is, quote, aberrant, a very bad strategy, and sends the wrong signals. I, Raul Lowry Contreras, wouldn't be so diplomatic. It's just plain stupid. Stupid because it's obviously written by a United Auto Workers Union lobbyist. I would expect the United States Congress to correct the course, but we have to see the final determination that the position of Tatiana Cloutier was correct, Guajardo said, referring to the economy minister's warning earlier this month that the government would retaliate commercially with tariffs if BBB passed the Senate in its current form. Juan Carlos Baker, CEO, Chief Executive Officer of Ainsley Consultores, and a trade negotiator for the previous federal government, also advocated the imposition of tariffs if the United States violates the USMCA with its EV incentives. Quote, it doesn't involve more than selecting a range of products, determining tariffs, and publishing them in the official Federal Gazette. It's just that simple. The government doesn't have to go to Congress to get a new law. It's already there. With regard to the proposed electricity reform of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, Baker remarked, quote, I have no doubt that the United States and other countries will use retaliation mechanisms. That's what they're for, to guarantee compliance with trade rights, unquote. There are two fights here, in my view. Joe Biden continues to insist on 100% union membership for American workers, and that is a huge minus, a huge negative in a society where less than 1 in 10 American non-governmental workers are union. And he is pushing for legislation that requires union membership, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is un-American. Forcing people to join a union is not free enterprise. Number two, on the Mexican side, ultra-socialist President Andrés Manuel López Obrador is insisting on wrecking one of the world's best electrical generation systems built on private investment that entered Mexico as recently as 2014. That's the year when Mexico changed more than half a century's prohibition of private energy participation. López Obrador wants the government's antiquated and inefficient and oil coal-burning Comisión Federal de Electricidad to be guaranteed 54% of Mexico's electrical energy production and distribution forever, especially after López Obrador is termed out as president in less than 3 years. López Obrador's government refuses to certify today a number of private facilities that are ready to enter the energy grid today. They represent millions of dollars in private enterprise by Spanish, Canadian, Mexican, and American private investments. They represent a huge potential volume of electricity generated by renewable sources. López Obrador, fortunately, lost his supermajority in Congress in the June federal election. Thus, he cannot pass his proposal into law in Congress without his supermajority. He has scheduled a nationwide consultation where the people would vote, a referendum for April, hoping that the people will support his proposal. In the end, the courts will determine whether or not López Obrador gets his way and destroys future private investments in Mexico. Private investments that Mexico desperately needs to grow, as do any economies that want to grow. They have to have investments. That and the end of his administration scheduled for November 30th, 2024. Let's stay on the subject of President López Obrador from a slightly different perspective. Let us look at President López Obrador's whimsical thoughts on the scheduled end of his presidency. He says he will retire in 2024, turn off his phone, and write a book about conservative thinking. The president said he will live off his pension and savings and that he intends to maintain a low profile after leaving office at the end of his 6-year term. He told reporters that he will retire in September 2024, provided a majority of citizens support his the continuation of his presidency at a planned revocation of mandate referendum next year. Please note, Mexico does not have a vice president. As far as I know, the Mexican Constitution does not mention a revocation of mandate referendum. AMLO has, as the president is best known, has pledged to leave office early if his rule is rejected at the vote, which was slated to be held in April, but was indefinitely postponed by the National Electoral Institute on the grounds it doesn't have sufficient funds to organize it. Quote, if we have the confidence of the people, AMLO says, and they want us to continue, I'll stay on as president, but only until September of 2024. He continues, I'm going to retire. I've already said that I won't participate in political activities or conferences or any public act or ceremony. He continues, I am not going to make declarations of any kind, López Obrador added, asserting that he won't even intervene to help his friends if they find themselves in problematic situations. He says, I'm going to turn off my phone. My sons and my grandchildren will always be welcome at my Palenque ranch, but zero politics because we have to hand the baton to those who come behind us. The problem with that, if he resigns in September of 2024, before his term ends on November 30th of 2024, who would become president? There is no vice president to assume the office. Can López Obrador be trusted to live up to his words? I don't think so. I don't think so. The president must be joking. He certainly knows there is no vice president to take over as president if he dies or resigns before his term is up. After all, he is a lawyer. An article by Mexican lawyer Alejandro Envila Fisher in Pulse News Mexico demolishes López Obrador's words and thoughts. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's appointment of former, this is from the article, Tabasco Governor Adán Augusto López Hernández to replace Olga Sánchez Cordero to head the nation's Interior Secretariat, Secretario de Gobernación, smacks of political maneuvering and foreshadows further plans to restructure the presidential team with an undeniable hint of succession. At first, it seemed that López Hernández's appointment was just a bad joke. But as the days go by, more and more pundits in Mexico are giving credence to the possibility that the real presidential successor has just arrived to the cabinet and is, not so coincidentally, from AMLO's home state of Tabasco. In the middle of his 6-year term, López Obrador's fixation on returning to the modes and methodology of the nepotistic practices of Luis Echeverría, who was president of Mexico from 1970 to 1976, is a secret for no one. I should add that Echeverria was from the PRI party. He is properly referred to as a pre-dinosaur. Back to the article. AMLO cut his political teeth during Echeverria's term, and with every action and decree he takes, the president has made it perfectly clear that the model of Mexico that he intends to reinstall socially, economically, and of course politically. Let me take a side note here. Echeverria is one of the 3 Mexican presidents I dealt with during my 4 years as public relations for the Caliente racetrack in Tijuana, Baja California, Mexico. I started with Gustavo Díaz Ordaz, president, when I started work in 1967. Then came his successor, President Luis Echeverria. Then came his successor, President Portillo. Echeverria was the Secretary of Gobernación or Interior under Díaz Ordaz. He is alleged to have ordered the massacre of hundreds of Mexican student protesters days before the 1968 Mexico City Olympics. That was the massacre of Tlatelolco. Echeverria has been charged several times with crimes for ordering the massacre, but never convicted, or the charges were dismissed by judges for statute of limitations problems. Now, back to today and the article. AMLO's goal is to reconfigure Mexico's government so that it only monitors every transaction and guarantees the legality of its often clandestine operations within a supposedly free market system, but also to proactively intervene in that market to eliminate competition with price controls. Companies such as Gas, Bienestar, and monopolized services such as those of the Federal Electricity Commission, the CFE. This is a redux of the economic model perfected by Echeverria in the 1970s and is the modus operandi of a leader who feels his calling it to tame the global marketplace. AMLO's social policy is based on the idea of establishing and granting generalized subsidies to support certain social groups with direct deliveries of resources in the form of cash and government handouts. This model, also typical of the 1970s, lacks the methodological rigor of programs evaluated through the fulfillment of established and quantifiable goals. It does establish specific requirements for access to benefits, thus eliminating the concept of incentives for accomplishments. Consequently, its focus does not prevent it from reaching those who do not need it. Measurement and control instruments of this type, which institutionalize programs and help prevent their clientelistic use, are in AMLO's eyes a thing of the neoliberal past. AMLO has also bent over backwards to dismantle the electoral body set up to ensure democracy in order to return to the government full responsibility of organizing elections, as was the case in Mexico, in the Mexico of Echeverria. López Obrador's command to Mexico's legislative and judiciary branches to pass his initiatives word for word without changing a single comma, and his incessant attacks and discreditations of judges, magistrates, and ministers of the court when they dare to disagree with one of his pet projects, such as the electricity industry law, stopped by Judge Juan Pablo Gómez Fierro, are another clear example of his preference for an ultra-presidential system. In the Mexico of the 1970s, the president was the great referee who had the last word in every dispute or great decision. His chief operator, endowed with immense political, police, investigative, and economic resources without real counterweights, was the Interior Secretariat. Hence, an appointment to head that secretariat was a natural springboard for presidential candidates. That was the Mexico of the 1970s, and that's the Mexico Andrés Manuel López Obrador wants to leave when he leaves office. López Obrador is a disaster. He's a total disaster. We're going to take a break here, and when we return, we will continue our look at the politics all around us. Thank you for being there. We'll be right back.
Regresamos.
La cabaña de Anita, cocina económica.
Mi nombre es Laura Vizcarra, tengo 18 años en el mundo de la micropigmentación y actualmente soy artista film. Si tú estás interesada en hacer microblading, es venir conmigo, hacer una consulta y una valoración previa y así poderte explicar más del procedimiento de microblading. ¿Quieres lucir unas cejas hermosas? Te invito a que me visites en Meraki Beauty Salón. Es gratis, te esperamos.
El café del Moreno le pone sabor a su vida. Venga a conocer nuestra nueva sucursal en Otay. Estamos por la subida de la central camionera frente a la plaza Otay Alameda. Contamos con una gran variedad de deliciosas bebidas y postres. También nos encuentras en Plaza Río, frente a Burger King.
Let's return to Mexico and let's continue our article from Pulse de Mexico. In the Mexico of the 1970s, the president was the great referee who had the last word in every dispute or great decision. His chief operator, endowed with immense political police and police investigative and economic resources, without real counterweights, was the Interior Secretariat, the Secretario de Gobernación. Hence, an appointment to head SEGAB, as it's called in Mexico, Secretario de Gobernación, was a natural springboard for presidential candidates. That was a Mexico focused on political stability, and it produced high rates of economic growth. It was a Mexico where the military, where the army remained in their barracks, helping in emergencies due to natural disasters and far away from politics. The 1970s, was a Mexico with marginal organized crime and submissive governors who did the bidding of the president because they owed their position to him. It was a Mexico with testimonial oppositions and no real possibilities of fighting for power. It was a Mexico with teachers and workers controlled by large unions integrated into the state party, the party of PRI. It was a Mexico that functioned from an institutional design conceived to revolve around the presidential figure and will. And it was a Mexico that began to change gradually through a succession of political reforms that began in 1963 and had culminating moments in first 1976 and later in 1995 and 1996. That Mexico ceased to exist when former President Ernesto Zedillo, from Mexicali, by the way, which is watching this program on cable, when former President Ernesto Zedillo definitively liquidated the imperial presidency by endowing the Supreme Court and the Bank of Mexico, the Banco de Mexico, with real autonomy, and by removing the government from the electoral organization to hand it over to parties with an independent federal electoral institute, the IFE. Today, the arrival of a man with all the president's trust to the Interior Secretariat, complemented by yet another scandal with the repression of new opposition mayors in Mexico City, which involves and tarnishes the reputation of the capital's mayor, Claudia Sheinbaum, who also has presidential ambitions, forces us to consider the possibility that AMLO, López Obrador, is launching the country into what he thought was a distant political past to jettison his candidate for the future in 2024. The problem with AMLO's plan is that Mexico is not the same country it was in 1976. This article was written by Alejandro Envila Fisher. He's a lawyer and professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM School of Law. López Obrador has previously said that he intends to retire to his ranch to write a book. He said that it will be on conservative thought, quote unquote, one of his favorite punching bags. We should note that López Obrador blames all Mexico's ills and problems, many of which have existed in Mexico for 500 years. He blames them on his critics and his predecessors as conservatives and neoliberals, and he blames conservatism and neoliberalism for all manner of ills in Mexico. Quote, I'm going to dedicate myself, he says, to researching and writing a book about conservative thought, which is an extremely important issue that I'm very interested in. The book will be a contribution to the new generations that's basically what I'm going to dedicate myself to, AMLO says. What will I live on? Well, I will have the right to my state workers' social security institute pension. And my wife, Beatriz, has her work. She's a researcher, and we have savings. That's what we'll live on. Besides, I'm not used to a life of luxury, said the famously austere president who doesn't even have credit cards, who has eschewed personal bodyguards and makes a habit of eating in humble eateries while touring the country. He says, I quote, I believe in humility. I believe that one should have the basics, the essentials, and that's what I want for all the people of Mexico. In my philosophy, money has never interested me, never. López Obrador, who triumphed at the 2018 presidential election after finishing second at the previous two elections, said that he will dedicate himself completely to his work in the coming years so that he can leave the presidency with no regrets. Quote, I'm not going to fail the people from now until September 2024, nothing but hard work. But Mr. President, your term doesn't end until November 30th, 2024. How will Mexico exist if you resign months before your term ends? Who would function as president? Another political hack from Tabasco, or a man or woman elected by the people of Mexico, unfortunately, like you were in 2018? Lastly, President López Obrador expressed satisfaction with a one-day low homicide total. November homicides are down. AMLO celebrates a Monday in which only 68 people were murdered in Mexico. He said, and I quote, not a bad day. November was the least violent month since President López Obrador took office in December 2018, federal data shows. There were 2,593 homicides in November, the lowest monthly figure since February 2018. Security Minister Rosa Isela Rodriguez reported that homicides declined 3.8% in the first 11 months of 2021 compared to the same period of 2020. Month-over-month declines were recorded in each of the past 4 months. That was a total of 30,693 homicides between January and November for an average of 92 per day. Rodriguez said that homicides in Mexico's 50 most violent municipalities have declined 1.8% since the government ramped up security efforts in late July. Between August and November, there were 4,555 homicides in these municipalities, among which are Tijuana, Ciudad Juárez, León, Acapulco, and Guadalajara. After noting that the murder rate is on the wane, the president declared that Monday wasn't a bad day because there were only 68 homicides. His boast attracted an avalanche of criticism on social media. quote, Mr. President, there are 300 homicides a year in Spain. Don't say stupid things. When someday no one in the country is killed, brag then, said one Twitter user. Another quote, he probably said that because of those 68 homicides, none involved a member of his distinguished family. He's more removed from reality every day, and it's clear he doesn't care about the country or its inhabitants, said another critic. Now, let's cross the border to the U.S. and talk about what's going on in politics. First, let's take a quick break, and then we'll be right back.
Regresamos.
La cabaña de Anita, cocina económica.
Mi nombre es Laura Vizcarra, tengo 18 años en el mundo de la micropigmentación y actualmente soy artista film. Si tú estás interesada en hacer microblading, es venir conmigo, hacer una consulta y una valoración previa y así poderte explicar más del procedimiento de microblading. ¿Quieres lucir unas cejas hermosas? Te invito a que me visites en Meraki Beauty Salón. Es gratis, te esperamos.
El café del Moreno le pone sabor a su vida. Venga a conocer nuestra nueva sucursal en Otay. Estamos por la subida de la central camionera frente a la plaza Otay Alameda. Contamos con una gran variedad de deliciosas bebidas y postres. También nos encuentras en Plaza Río, frente a Burger King.
There is our program for the week. We thank you for being there. We wish you will be there next week at the same time, 10 o'clock Sunday morning, here on CNR cable in the state of Baja California, and YouTube and Facebook. Please be there. We need you to be there, to listen, to watch, and to think along with us about the future of the United States and Mexico. We want to thank GTV for production in Tijuana, and of course, CNR Cable for cablecasting this program to hundreds of thousands of people. We request that you tell your friends about this show. Let's build this audience up to where it has an effect on the thinking in Mexico and the United States. Thank you. We'll see you next week.